Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Elizabeth Medina. The past year has seen a surge in violence and hate crimes against Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, recently found there was a 145% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes nationwide between 2019 and 2020. Los Angeles saw more than twice the number of anti-Asian hate crimes last year, even though hate crimes overall were only up 9%. But those are only the incidents we know about. Many Asian American and Pacific Islander communities are reporting a surge in everything from verbal threats to physical attacks, many of which have gone unreported. President Biden has acknowledged the increase in racism Asian Americans have faced.
It's been a year of living in fear for their lives, just to walk down the street. Grandparents are afraid to leave their homes. Small business owners targeted and gunned down. Attacks on some of the most vulnerable people in our nation, the elderly, low-wage workers, and women. In fact, Asian American women suffer twice as many incidents of harassment and violence as Asian American men. We're learning again what we've always known. Words have consequences.
Biden spoke on the issue earlier this month after a white man went on a shooting spree at 3 Atlanta area spas. Authorities say he confessed to killing 8 people. 7 of the victims were women, 6 were of Asian descent. Local authorities have repeated the suspected shooter's claim that he was not motivated by race. Still, the shootings have galvanized Asian American communities across the nation. In the weeks since, they've organized rallies and vigils to mourn the victims and to condemn growing threats against people of Asian descent.
It's just, again, showing solidarity. It's really important for us to be out in public and do this because it shows other people that they're not alone.
Now the questions remain. How did we get to this point? And is there anything that can be done? On Point's Daniela Torres has more.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Today we have with us Tiffany from Chinatown Community for Equitable Development. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Tiffany. So I wanted to start off by asking you, your organization advocates for residents of Chinatown. Have you or people involved in your organization ever felt targeted because of your race?
CCED, we're an all-volunteer organization and with a large number of members, and to say that we haven't would be completely false. And at the same time, I think I want to quote one of our tenant leaders that we talked to recently, where he was just like, when we talked to them about the most recent spate of violence, where the media is finally catching on in a big way, in the sense that this was actually already happening for a year, right? Like this was been happening since the beginning of the pandemic. And I think mass media, for a large part, has only jumped on now, or like powers that be decided to really focus in on it now. And so one of our elders was just like, this is nothing new. We have been facing this even before the pandemic, in the sense that anti-Asian violence against, or racism against Asian Americans has always been there. And so, definitely when we were talking about it with our elders, people definitely have stories to tell. And I think, it definitely has happened. I don't think like in other places and cities, they have been as egregious, right, in terms of being documented, or when they haven't gone as viral, but things do happen, as it does in a lot of communities, but especially in communities where they are under-resourced, right? So
I know that recently we've all seen a rise in discrimination against Asian Americans throughout the country. Are there any specific experiences that you would be comfortable sharing, that maybe someone that you know of or that you have gone through recently?
I mean, I think too, I think you have to remember, for us at CCED, because we are an organization that fights gentrification, for us, that violence really comes down to economic violence. And so the stories that we focus on and that we that we like to tell are about how gentrification is really completely tearing apart our community. The way that the evictions really kick people out, that is violence, right? That is part of anti-Asian violence, when Developers come into the Chinatown community, refuse to acknowledge the humanity of our elders, and then refuse to give our elders the amenities and the services that actually serve the working class elders that live in our community, and instead cater to middle class gentrifiers, often white folks, sometimes even other Asian Americans that have class privilege, right? So we think that that is the form of violence that we tend to focus on when it comes to incidences of racism, right? Like this entire system of gentrification in which our community is being displaced is incredibly violent because people are literally being kicked out of their homes. And so that is definitely one aspect of violence that, like, in terms of our organization, are like our perspective when it comes to what's happening.
Yeah, definitely. A student that we spoke to, Nguyen, he's a Cal State Long Beach student. He actually shared with us that he's experienced discrimination even while using public transportation lately as well.
Yeah, sometimes, like when I took in the bus to go to school, and then, people like, they like, they try to like stay away from me. And then, they say something bad about me. So then I just like leave them and then go to another seat.
Tiffany, you mentioned that a lot of the discrimination that people in your organization have experienced is, because of gentrification. Did you notice a rise in that throughout the pandemic?
Yeah, the pandemic has definitely made a lot of things worse when it comes to violence upon low-income immigrant communities, right? In the sense that, like, number one, there was the beginning of the economic violence when people decided not to come to Chinatown, and that really hurt our businesses, right? They saw Chinatown as a pariah where the virus would be, when actually we've been quite safe because we take care of we've been safe, which helps keep the community safe. And sometimes there are, like, for the most part, incidences have been low in Chinatown, at least for the COVID virus, which is why, like, the discrimination that people have, people discriminating against Chinatown as a whole and refusing to do business there, refusing to come into it, that was incredibly hurtful to our businesses. That was even before it hit the United States. That was when things were happening in China in November, right, in December, before it even had come over to the United States. So then when it finally did hit in the United States in March, it increased dramatically the amount of economic suffering our communities faced, because we had to then shut down. So they were already suffering before because people were discriminating against, and then they were also shutting down because in the lockdown, right, the government refused to truly support small local businesses, right? They were giving out tons of money to corporations, but refused to do the outreach and to refuse to do their jobs to actually go out to the community and provide support to oftentimes non-English speaking businesses. So yeah, and then, it's only, it's been a struggle to stay afloat this entire pandemic. For example, even though, they keep passing these measures to, like, tenants have protections, that doesn't actually do anything because landlords still do end up doing what they want, right? Oftentimes the police, right, they don't actually support working class communities. They only support, the police are on the side of landlords who will then evict our communities, right? Evict our family members, which is why, like, they're not just not in Chinatown, but throughout the Los Angeles area, there have been a bunch of illegal lockouts. There have been illegal evictions. And whether or not they're illegal, the whole point is that it's inhumane and it's wrong to be evicting people and to enacting this type of violence. And so in Chinatown too, when it comes to Asian Americans, like, we're seeing the same thing where landlords are choosing to, like, force and harass their tenants rather than showing care and compassion, telling them, like, ooh, you owe $15,000 in back rent. Like, that is an eviction notice, right? And that is very much violence against the Asian American community.
Tiffany, would you be able to compare these events that you just spoke about to the events of the acts of authorities during the LA 92 riots, where we saw a lot of Korean Americans struggle with their businesses, but a lot of authorities failed to show up in their areas and, help them out?
In a way, yes. I think what we're seeing now is more of where Asian Americans are definitely being used as a wedge against the movement for Black lives, right? In the sense that there's a reason why the first videos that went viral were of a Black person harming elders. And actually, there have been plenty of instances where people have been hurting Asian American elders, but they don't go viral, right? The ones that went viral were the ones with Black folks in it, which is a question for Asian Americans, where in the sense that we really need to interrogate our own anti-Blackness, right? Like, why is it only now that we're deciding to pay attention, as well as the larger mass media, in the sense of they also need to interrogate their anti-Blackness. And we also have to be really clear that what's happening right now is that Asian Americans they're like essentially like using Asian Americans as a reason, the crime against Asian Americans, crime is not the word, violence against Asian Americans right now, as a way to privilege Asian Americans in the racial hierarchy. I know you asked about like the 92 riots and how like authorities like just didn't do anything. And I think that's the thing, right? It's like we cannot trust the authorities or the people in power at all, right? They will continue to try to put more funding into police rather than actually keeping us safe. / like in the case of the 92 riots, I remember like they really actually blocked Koreatown off and like kind of let it burn, right? And so it's really important for Asian Americans to recognize that history and to know where we stand, and it should be in solidarity with Black folks because yeah, the authorities will definitely leave us out to dry.
Earlier you mentioned that Asian Americans are being sort of privileged. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, there's like a reason why like Asian Americans have a lot of privilege in the society, in the sense that like, I don't want to get too academic here, but there's that racial triangulation theory. It's a really long word. In the system of white supremacy, Asian Americans are also oppressed, right? Alongside brown and Black communities. And the interesting part though, is that Asian Americans, because of the way that immigration, because like the systems in power decided like, oh, these select type of immigrants get to come in, like Asian American doctors, Asian Americans, like specific, that kind of immigration patterns where they selected types of people to come in. You know, there's like a system in which they allow for bits of humanization of Asian Americans, right? That's the model minority myth, right? Where they will give us a little bit like crumbs of humanity while at the same time continuing to oppress us, because if we get out of line, we are just another person of color, right? Which is what kind of like what's happening right now in terms of we will just be another community that's scapegoated, right? But it's interesting for Asian Americans how like those periods of being scapegoated, they're cyclical. Whereas for Black Americans, it happens all the time. There has been no relief, right? But Asian Americans, like there are periods and cycles where this kind of violence kind of subsides a little, but then it then increases. Like I think it's just like moments in history where it's worse, right? When for Black Americans, it's always been bad. And I think that's where, you know, for us, we're not here trying to, you know, the types of oppressions are very much different. And because of that, I think it's really important for Asian Americans to understand our position in US society in a white supremacist state, I guess is the best way to put it. I'm not sure if I explained that well or not.
Going back to student Nguyen from Cal State Long Beach, he mentioned that he would like to see an America where there is no discrimination.
America is like a country of all nations, everybody, all the different country, different races. So I hopefully there's no discrimination, and then we all live together.
Going off of what Hoy said, do you feel that discrimination, or do you feel that we'll see a change after the pandemic?
Will there be an end? Absolutely not. I think like, you know, I had a speech at a rally recently against anti-Asian violence where I said like, it will get worse before it gets better. Right. So I don't think we're out of the worst part yet. There's no way. And especially because, right, that weekend after, or like I said that on a weekend, and then 3 or 4 days later, the murders in Atlanta happened, right? So it is going to continue to get worse before it gets better.
We also spoke to an Asian American gentleman at the rally, and he spoke to us about how we can prevent violence toward Asian Americans from occurring, and this is what he had to say.
We need to stick together. White folks, Asians, black folks, and everybody else. We need to stick together and overcome white supremacy.
What would you recommend to overcome, situations like this, like what he just mentioned?
Exactly. We should definitely stick together. I think that's definitely what we mean by Asian Americans are really faced with a choice right now, which is to call for more policing of our neighborhoods or to reject that call and stand with the Black liberation movement and say, no, we want to defund the police. We would like to abolish the police because we know that police are essentially the strong arm of white supremacy.
So thank you so much for meeting with us today, Tiffany, and sharing, your input, your thoughts, and that's all the time that we have for today.
If you need anything else, just let us know.
Joining us now is Professor Teresa Williams-Leon. Hi, Professor. So I wanted to start off by saying that I know recently we've seen a lot of discrimination against Asian Americans throughout the country, and we've seen it worsen. And so I wanted to ask you, why do you feel that racial discriminations against Asian Americans has worsened recently?
There's been a history of this since the beginning of, Asians arriving in the United States in the 1830s. So there's always been that history and precedent. But I think within the last year, with the coronavirus originating in Wuhan, China, the rhetoric by the previous president, I think all of those things, and people feeling frustrated, right? There's always this need for scapegoating, blaming when our lives aren't going well. Businesses are shutting down. We're not able to go to school and go to work. And so I think, all of those, sort of this perfect storm came together to kind of blame people of Asian descent. And, we see this in the history that, in previous hate crimes in the 1980s and the 1990s, where, all Asians are the same, right? So it doesn't matter if somebody is Chinese, Japanese, Thai, Filipino, that, if we see somebody who's Asian wearing that so-called racial uniform, if you will, then, people see, one Asian, Chinese, all the same. I'm not happy, I'm going after you.
Do you feel that Trump's use of the term China virus gave other Americans permission to use it and potentially harm other Asian Americans?
Absolutely, right? I mean, the tone is being set from the top, right? The bully pulpit of the president. And it's not just China virus, but, epithets like Kung flu. And he even changed in one of his speeches, right, to foreign flu, right? So again, Asian Americans being perpetual foreigners who really don't belong here, bringing diseases and all these awful things to our country. So all of that, I think, plays into it. And, it has been a part of America's subconscious, right, to have these kinds of prejudices always sort of underneath the surface of American society. So when things like this happen and you have a president using inflammatory language, it all boils up to the surface. And that's what we're seeing.
And you mentioned that, this discrimination didn't just start throughout the pandemic. There's a history of it. And more than a century ago, San Francisco segregated immigrant students from Asian countries into separate schools. How has the history of this segregation formed, the modern experience of being an Asian American?
Right. Well, I mean, the laws have definitely played a role in marginalizing and excluding people of Asian descent. The Chinese were the very first, for example, to be kept from immigrating based on national origin and race, the Chinese Exclusion Act. A few months before the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted, the then governor of California, George Perkins, declared March 4th, 1882, an anti-Chinese holiday. So the segregation in the schools, the Chinese not being able to testify against white Americans when they were attacked physically, all of these things, law after law, statute after statute, played itself out. So definitely that history has always been there. So to understand what's happening right now in 2020, 2021, we have to put that into context. And gender also plays a role. We see the intersection of racism and sexism playing a role. Between March of 2020 and February of 2021, there were almost 4,000 attacks against people of Asian descent. And about 68% of those attacks were against women. And another significant number were against the elders in our communities.
Why do you feel that, women and elders of Asian American descent have been targeted more?
It may be that there's a sense that they're more vulnerable. And, it's really about exertion of power over people. And so I think perhaps that's, partly why, right, women and elders being, spat on, beaten up, attacked, robbed. Recently, there was an 84-year-old Thai grandfather, Vicha Ratanapakdi, who was shoved, and the force blunt of the shove in Oakland, California, led to his death. There's also a 61-year-old Filipino man in New York City who was slashed with a box cutter. In San Jose, a Vietnamese grandmother was assaulted and robbed. We can go on and on with these, these horrific cases of elders being attacked, as well as women.
Of course, yeah. And then I know there's a number of historical events, like you mentioned, where Asian Americans have experienced discrimination, and it leads me to ask about the internment of Japanese Americans. And was that ultimately a form of racism performed by the government? And do you see any similar acts in our system today?
Absolutely. When we look at Americans of Japanese descent, right, whose civil rights were denied. We were at war during World War II with Japan, Italy, and Germany, right? But it was only the Japanese who were singled out and treated as enemy aliens. They were forced to give up their lifetime earnings to be rounded up and put into these concentration camps. And again, I think it stems from that idea that Asians are really not true Americans, right? They're not to be trusted. They're perpetually foreign, no matter how long they've been here. So that question that's asked of many Asian Americans, where are you from? Right? Seemingly innocent question, when that's asked of Asian Americans, it has layers of deeper meaning about their belonging, whether they truly should be here or not. And so the internment was really this kind of state-sanctioned way of saying you're not one of us.
And what would you tell the community in today's society, or how would you recommend to today's society to combat issues like this, how to talk about issues like this and bring more awareness?
Definitely, education is important. That's one of the things that we do here at Cal State Northridge in Asian American Studies is, teaching the history and the relevance of that history to today, right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, this is happening today, but not having that kind of historical background to say, wow, the connection is very clear. And certainly, having Asian Americans become more and more visible and to understand the complexity of the Asian American, Pacific Islander, Desi American communities, where we are diverse, the way in which different groups have arrived as immigrants, as indigenous peoples, as refugees, and makes our communities very complex. So I think that kind of, telling our stories, having our stories heard, making, ourselves more visible, and to, and furthermore, to really legitimize, right, that Asian Americans are Americans and we're here to stay.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Professor. We are running short on time, so that is all that we actually have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
When I was in foster care, I never knew when I would have to move, so I always had my suitcase ready to go. Then one day, I was adopted. My new parents opened their hearts and home to me. My parents cook my favorite breakfast for me every morning. My parents take me on trips I never thought I would go on. They gave me a home and an even better reason to use that suitcase. My parents aren't perfect, but they're perfect for me.
What are you doing in there?
What's that?
I wouldn't do that. What are you doing? What are you looking for?
Yo, Scott.
Hey.
I'm heading out, man. You want to ride?
No, I got my car, but I actually really need to go to the bathroom.
Oh, you know what? I was just in there. The line is like 10 people long.
You know, I think I'll just...
Dude, are you okay?
You wouldn't believe what I was just thinking. I am definitely buzzed.
Yeah.
I think I will take this, and I will take that ride home.
Smart man.
Did you see how that dog was looking at me?
Here's to the things that can keep us safe. And now, those that we carry with us everywhere will bring us wireless emergency alerts. With the unique sound and vibration, you'll be in the know, wherever you are.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings. You can also watch us on LA 36 and Santa Clarita Valley Television. For Daniela Torres and producers Kristen Carmazin, Angela Gonzalez, and Bryce Wayne, I'm Elizabeth Medina.